Hi, my name is Kevin, and I collect old irons. The topic for today is the millinery irons. This is a very minor category among old irons, and something that I knew very little about. But my discovery process has been interesting, and I'd like to tell you what I learned. The term millinery comes from Milan in Italy, which was once the center of hat-making activity in old Europe. In the United States, judging by the trade cards, advertisements, and the markings on some of the millinery irons that we'll be talking about, the center was very much exclusively New York City. And I understand that circa 1900, in New York City, there was some 80,000 milliners, many of them, I'm sure, women, employed in that industry. In a previous video, we've talked about the hat irons. These were irons used for men's hats, used by the hatter. The milliner was, and the millinery products were associated with women's clothing and women's hats, and probably a lot of the people employed in this industry were women. The milliner might run a shop selling small fabric items for women trade. These could be gloves, purses, and so forth. And the milliner is basically the female equivalent of the haberdasher, which would have sold a similar range of products for the men trade. And both the milliner and the haberdasher surely must have sold a lot of hats. There is quite a distinction between men's hats and women's hats, and the associated irons for each of these. Men's hat fashion is perhaps one of the most conservative topics you can find anywhere, whereas women's hat fashions very much change from one year to the next. Now, a rich woman could easily afford a new hat coming the new year. But for those in genteel poverty, such as the heroine families of the Jane Austen novels, you would get some new ribbons and you would refashion last year's hats. And if you have looked at Pride and Prejudice, very good read by the way, you see the women in the shops fretting a lot about ribbons and hats. The hats of the early 1800s were relatively simple. The milliner could buy woven chips, as they were called, which would serve as the base for the hat, on which they could decorate with ribbons and other trimmings to form bonnets. The ribbons could be fashioned by using various iron devices shaped like balls or eggs. These could be mounted on a table, this is called a standing iron, or they could be on a handle. The standing irons we'll talk about in greater detail in another video. Primarily, these had cylinder-shaped devices called goffers that were used for the very fancy collars such as this young lady is wearing. These devices could be shaped like balls or shaped like an egg, and they came in a wide range of sizes from very large to quite small. And there were other kinds of shapes as well. The handles could be pointed so that you could put it into a hole on your table for easy access or perhaps as a standing iron. In terms of values, individually these irons don't go for much, 20, 30, maybe a few more dollars. But a complete set that has good preservation and a wide range of different types, perhaps with a base or a stand for all of them, might cost several $100s. Also worth mentioning at this time are something called the edge irons, and these are sort of scissors-like devices. They, from a distance, look like the bullet molds, except that these have flat faces inside, and these would be for the edges of hats, maybe could be used on the tips of collars and other such locations in fabric as well. As we know, Victorian times brought fancy styles in clothing which necessitated fluting irons, and the hats were similarly stylish. In order to better understand the hats of the late 1800s, I've been consulting trade cards. My observation is that trade cards of the late 1800s by and large do not include dates. There are, for example, abundant trade cards for the Mrs. Potts irons that we'll be seeing in a later video. No dates on these, and there's no need for dates because Mrs. Potts sat irons don't go out of fashion. But trade cards showing Victorian hats are dated. We can look at this trade card illustrating the Myra hat, and the Myra hat shows what was high fashion in Victorian times, which were hats that had feathers or tails, wings, or in this case, whole birds. And if we look at the reverse of the card, we see that this hat is for autumn to winter 1885 to 1886. Heaven forbid if you got caught wearing last year's hat. And we can look at this trade card here and see another hat, this hat from 1886, that uses bird feathers. These hats surely were very hard on the birds. And indeed, in the late 1800s, Brazil's #1 export was bird feathers. The United States once had native parrots. The Carolina parakeet was hunted to extinction in the late 1800s to early 1900s. Being a naturalist, I was interested to learn while researching for this video that the last Carolina parakeet died in captivity at the Cincinnati Zoo in the same cage in which the last passenger pigeon died a few years before. That is one ignominious birdcage. These bird hats created an early environmentalist movement, in part led by John Audubon, to save these birds by shaming the people who were wearing these avian hats. So hats made of bird parts transitioned in the 1890s to flowers. This illustration is dated 1902 and probably comes from a fashion magazine showing hats of that period. And these hats are quite elaborate, and looking at the topmost image, we see one very elaborate flowered hat. Now I need to tell you that no flowers were harmed in this process. These flowers are handmade from silk. And there are various millinery texts of that period and today that talk about the elaborate process of hand making flowers. There are some YouTube videos that show this as well. The handmade flowers must have been expensive, and tastes in the 19-teens and 1920s went simple again. This led to a fairly short use of a shortcut process to the making of the flowers, which are what we call the flower irons. I have about 8 or 10 of the flower irons. They come in various sizes. They might show full flowers, they might show leaves. They have a top and bottom piece. The bottom piece is usually made of brass, the top often iron, but it could also be brass. Besides the flower and leaves, there are sometimes portions of a flower, sometimes there are geometrical patterns. And they come in all kinds of various sizes. Here is a relatively small flower iron, and then here is one that I bought earlier this summer that's quite considerable in size. These have prices in the $50, $75, maybe a little bit higher per flower iron. Of course, you do want to be looking for the top and bottom pieces. The large one here I paid something more than $100 for. These irons were used to create flower designs that could be incorporated into the pillbox hats that were popular in the 1920s. Can you imagine this doll, or maybe I should call her a flapper, dancing a Charleston? So how were these hat irons used? While there's quite a literature on the making and use of the handmade flowers, we can find nothing on the use of these flower irons. But there is an interesting YouTube video from a flower making store in New York City that's been in business for 100 years, and that is 100 years that goes back to the use of these things. And they have a bit of an industrial operation using a pneumatic press and so forth, but the core of that are devices such as these. Going backward from that, we've done some experiments on our own, and what we've done is we've heated the bottom part, very much like a fluter bottom would be heated, and we put some silk fabric on top. We have found that that needs to be starched, and we also found that you do not want to heat this too hot because it can burn up the fabric very easily. You put this in here, hold it down for a little bit, and you can get a flower design. And then, of course, you can nest various sizes of these flowers together and do some other things to create a flower pattern. Kate thinks I should be better dressed for the upcoming Northern Maine social season. What do you think?